What you're about to hear is a conversation which took place in the old refectory of the Yale Divinity School on April 6th of 2026 between me and Christian Wiman, poet and theological thinker. We're going to talk at first about consciousness and the way that it is not understood. There's no physical explanation for why we have consciousness. It's a mystery not unlike religious mysteries. But we'll also talk about the value of poetry in life and what keeps us living, what's worth living for. All of that is to come. I'm so excited to be here with Christian Wiman, many of you know, author, editor, or translator, variously, of 15 books, most recently Glimmerings, Letters on Faith Between a Poet and a Theologian. He is the Clement Mule Professor of Communications Arts at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music and Yale Divinity School. You know, I want to begin, because one of the many things that you've done that just knocked me out was this very, very celebrated essay in Harper's, where you wrote about the connections between consciousness and ways we think about divinity. And I'd like to begin there because I'm also borderline obsessed with this whole topic as well. Maybe begin, was there sort of a moment, did you have a particular epiphany or aperçu where you thought, here's why I want to tackle that?
I've actually been thinking about it for a long time. And like most things in my life, it comes to me through poetry. And like most things in my life, I think these ideas are original. And then I start to read and realize that other people have had them before, which was the case with this. I was brooding on the topic, and Harper's approached me with this series that they had and asked if I would write something. And so that's what I decided to write. And I had Ian McGilchrist's books. I mean, there's one book, but 2 volumes, this huge book called The Matter with Things, masterpiece, sitting there, and I'd started it, and I knew that I needed to read this thing, even though it was so long. I have a hard time reading books that are so long, but I knew I needed it. Once I got the directive to do the piece, I took 3 months, actually, and spent it with that book, and tracked down his sources, tracked down the things he had read, and I spent every bit of my time just reading. And that's when everything coalesced.
So let's sort of bring the audience along with us on this. So, I mean, when you think about consciousness, in a way, consciousness is the only thing we can sort of say that we know, right? Everything that's happening in your mind right now, you're sitting here, you're thinking, this is an uncomfortable seat that I'm sitting in. I hope this is going to be really interesting. But your entire experience of being here right now is processed through consciousness. And questions about the outside world and the reality of everything that we are experiencing as consciousness are a little bit murkier. But there is sort of an ongoing battle between what we might call materialists, who basically believe there is a biomedical explanation or chemical or something explanation for consciousness. We just haven't found it yet. And then a group of other people who are, first of all, saying, well, why haven't you found it yet? If it's there, I mean, here is this very fundamental thing for which there is no real acceptable physical explanation. But you could probably say more about that than I just did.
Yeah, well, we mentioned Daniel Dennett earlier before the show started, and he used to describe consciousness as a benign user illusion. And so it's just, your brain is a mechanical thing, and it just is producing this phenomenon that you think of as consciousness, but it's not real. All these things are just, the neurons are firing and creating it, and it's an illusion. There's another emergent theory of consciousness, re-emergent, because it's been around since the ancients, that suggests that mind is in all things, as Heraclitus put it, or that, as Thales put it, all things are full of gods. And so this is the notion that consciousness is, the brain acts more as a filter than a projector. That consciousness is a phenomena that's outside of the brain as well as inside of it, so that it actually gets filtered. And when you see people who get these tremendous injuries where they lose a faculty, and the materialists would say, well, obviously consciousness is controlled by those neurons because they're damaged. The people who make the argument that the brain is a filter would say, no, you've just gone numb in the area that perceives this part of consciousness. You've simply, part of the filter has become broken. And so those are the two main ideas that I'm working with in the essay, though there are other very sophisticated ideas of consciousness which I can barely understand, to tell you the truth.
Well, yeah, and we should say that the materialists, and I've not only interviewed Dennett, but I also interviewed Patricia Churchland, who's about as absolutist a materialist as you get. They can get a little snooty about all this. And one thing that I loved about your piece is, in the gentlest, nicest way, you point out, for example, that roughly 95% of the universe is either dark matter or dark energy. And each of those things are sort of propositions based on indirect evidence. They're kind of like the numbers don't work unless 95% of the universe is this stuff that we can't really quantify or explain. And, in the nicest possible way, I think you managed to suggest, why are they so insistent on biomedical proof when they're trafficking in a lot of stuff that isn't really provable in the way that we might want?
Yeah, one of the things that I like best about McGilchrist's work is the way he integrates philosophy and literature and science, all these things together. And he quotes one scientist at one point who says that it's inevitable that the language of physics has to be poetic because the world is poetic in some way. Like every word that you use to describe physics, whether it's a wave or anything you use, energy, mass, all these things are metaphors. And you have to reach for the metaphor to describe reality. And so it's inevitable that reality is in some way poetic. And McGilchrist is fusing those two things, I think. He's adamant about not traducing science. He is a scientist to the bone. But he doesn't believe that science is absolute in the way that we've come. That's in scientism, that science can explain everything.
So let's posit that there's an inadequate hard scientific explanation for consciousness, or the so-called hard problem. And that might open the door to some of the kinds of things that you write about in the essay. So for the sake of discussion, so what? What difference would that make to the average person if, in fact, it's true that consciousness can't be explained biomedically? What's the kind of so what that comes after that?
Yeah, I think it makes all the difference in the world to how you live your life. My ideas first started in this direction from William Wordsworth, and he would talk about something that is half created, half perceived, so that there's some kind of reciprocal activity going on between the mind and what's outside of the mind. I had the experience writing poems when I first began writing the real poems that were mine. I had given up on God, but I had the experience that reality was looking back at me. Something was emerging in the poems that was not me. And you can say it's the unconscious, but I agree with Fanny Howe, a writer I loved dearly. She's dead now. The essay is really a love letter to Fanny. She says, I don't know what the unconscious is, but I don't believe in the unconscious because whatever it is an un-anything. That's a great line. It's a real irony that we all act as if we know what the unconscious is. We go through our lives, we talk about it with our therapists about what the unconscious is, but nobody knows what the hell consciousness is. And it doesn't make sense. But what difference does it make in your life? I think we're all given these moments when reality opens for us, when we feel the unity of the world. The way Marilyn Robinson puts it is it can be an astonishing thing to realize that the world is addressed to you. And the you is not plural. The you is singular, addressed to every single one of us. And I think a life is made up of these moments when we've had this experience and then we wonder, well, what do we do with it? What do we do with it? And I think they ask something of us afterwards. They ask us to be religious people, maybe. They ask us to live differently. You must change your life, as Rilke puts it. But they do ask something of us. And I think that they can become a kind of weave of a life, can make a life coherent and give it meaning. So it does make a hell of a lot of difference, I think. And whether you believe in consciousness as mechanical or whether you believe it's a phenomenon that we participate in, a process.
I think there's also a question about attentiveness, because in fact, everything that you're talking about seems to me is preceded by enough attentiveness to be aware of maybe a moment where things unfold in a slightly different, more rapturous or all-encompassing way. And I do feel like we're living in an environment right now where there are instruments that are almost competing for our consciousness, or competing for the role of our consciousness. There are these things. There's New York Times Sunday Magazine this past Sunday had a piece about this idea, particularly about how people in their 20s are really starting to think, do I really want to depend on this thing that much? Should I silence it? Should I get something else? Should I? And I love the fact that they described one new product called the Sleek, a refurbished Google Pixel 7 smartphone running a custom operating system they called Odyssey OS. The name is a reference to Homer's poem where Odysseus binds himself to the mast. So he can't be lured by the sirens. That's the image that they have, that the siren call of this thing is so powerful that you have to metaphorically tie yourself to a piece of wood. But maybe say a little bit about how you see that. I mean, it does seem, I know for me, the moments when I can have a quiet, unfiltered, undisturbed thought when I'm not thinking about things that I know are in here, they are fewer and further between than they probably should be.
Yeah, I heard the head of Netflix quoted as saying that he thought of his primary competitors as being not necessarily the other players in the field, but as people's sleep. He was competing with people's sleep. That's pretty dire. That's pretty dire. Poetry is what I know, and poetry for me has been the way that I've come to consciousness and preserved it. I teach one undergraduate class here a year, usually. And my undergrads are very upset in the way you describe, that they feel their minds are under siege, but they also wonder, what is the point of studying poetry, talking about poetry, when the world is burning? Everything is going to hell, and why would you do this? And what I try to convey to them is that the first thing you have to do is preserve your own consciousness. It's the first bulwark that you have before you can make any action in the world. You've got to have your own consciousness. Poetry is a way for some of us, of doing that. People have other ways. They have music, they might, visual art, there might be woodworking. There are many ways you can do it. But for me, poetry has been incredibly important. I think studying poetry at a time like this, writing poetry at a time like this, sharing poetry, can be a very powerful act of resistance. It certainly has been in a lot of other countries.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it's also, there is that odd competition going on between our consciousness, which we are, I think, prepared to say maybe a little bit more than just flesh and bone, and then these substitute systems. In Stoppard's play, we were talking about this before we started here, Sir Tom Stoppard is, I think, is his last produced play. It was called The Hard Problem. It was about consciousness. There's a character in it, his name is, I think, Amal, and he starts out as a materialist. He starts out believing that this is all physically explicable. And not only that, but maybe it could be replicated, in a computer setting. And one of the things that he ultimately decides is that he doesn't know how to build a stupid computer. And what he means by stupid is a computer that could capture the spontaneity and irrationality of human beings. That, some of what is being human, I think, is in fact being very unpredictable, making leaps of imagination that don't really sort of make all that much sense, except that they do. And there we are kind of in the sphere of poetry too, I think.
Yeah, but not just poetry, science as well has to make these. I'm forgetting the scientist who said that every original act of science begins with a leap of faith. Famous scientist, but I forget his name. I want to read this one poem by Liesl Mueller because it goes back to that, what we were talking about, what can a poem do in a time when the world seems to overwhelm our faculties. She once said that poetry, for me, is the answer to how does one stay sane when private lives are being ransacked by public events. And then she wrote this poem. She fled when she was a child she was born in Germany, Jewish, fled World War II, died probably 15 years ago, it must have been almost 100, in her 90s. I met her in her 70s in Chicago. This is a very short little poem called There Are Mornings. Even now, when the plot calls for me to turn to stone, the sun intervenes. Some mornings in summer I step outside and the sky opens and pours itself into me as if I were a saint about to die. But the plot calls for me to live, be ordinary, say nothing to anyone. Inside the house, the mirrors burn when I pass. That is a moment of a woman being rescued by a poem, but also the poem rescuing the reader. The plot calls for you to turn to stone. Seems like too much to bear. And yet the sun intervenes. You don't do it. You ask the question I sort of avoided, what does the faculty of attention have to do with this? Of course, it has everything to do with it. You have to be attentive to the world in order to receive the world, attentive to God in order to receive God. The eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me, as Meister Eckhart put it in the 13th century. All these ideas have been around forever, man. None of this is new. But that said, this is an argument that I have with my friend and colleague Miroslav Volf, who I did that last book with. And for me, attention is paramount in the perception of reality and God. He disagrees, and he thinks that God comes from outside us, and what we have to do is be able to receive. And you could say that's a kind of an attention too, a kind of readiness. I have a friend who calls it iridescent readiness. Great phrase, iridescent readiness. But somewhere in between those two things, it can't all be attention. There's got to be some reciprocal action there.
Yeah, and there's got to be a staying open. Emerson has this great line, which I'm looking for right now. It's in Robert Richardson's biography of Emerson. It's, heaven walks among us ordinarily muffled in such triple or tenfold disguises that the wisest are deceived and no one suspects the days to be God's. And I love that idea that some of being attentive, some of being awake is realizing that what seems very quotidian and humdrum needs to be investigated a little bit more. And I see that in poetry in general, and I think in your poetry in particular.
Well, thank you, but absolutely. There's a critic called R.P. Blackmer who once said that what a fresh metaphor does is it enlarges the sphere of available reality, which is a great way to think of it. It makes reality accessible to you that maybe wasn't as accessible before. I do find that a helpful idea, and I think it's very true.
All right, we're going to take a little pause here. We're going to come back. Yes, she's holding up a sign. And we're going to take a little pause here. We will come back with more of Christian Wiman after this. And we're back. We're here at the Yale Divinity School. I'm here with Christian Wiman, poet, thinker, and teacher here, and many other things as well. I think we can sort of leap pretty effectively from what we were just talking about to a line of yours. The only true antidote to the plague of modern despair is an absolute and perhaps even annihilating awe. You know, you were saying before that it's not just a world of smartphones. It's a world that seems to provoke, understandably, despair. That's one of your jobs right now, first of all, as an artist, but also as a teacher. Maybe say a little bit more about that. I mean, anybody sitting in this room, all these young faces in this room, could be forgiven for wondering how they're going to get through this.
Well, it goes back to preserving your own consciousness, but I think, that idea originates for me with Abraham Joshua Heschel. He said that wonder was the basis of all religious experience, that without wonder, nothing else mattered. You could have all the law in the world, you could have all the ritual in the world, but if you lose that sense of wonder, it doesn't make any difference. And what he's doing is restoring the primacy to experience. Like that's part of what we were talking about earlier, that the people who want a material basis for reality are denying the essential value of experience. So what? It feels like you're conscious. Who cares? It's an illusion. But I think what Heschel's pointing to and what Ian McGilchrist is pointing to is experience itself is absolutely fundamental, and fundamental to our religious lives, moral lives, intellectual lives. So how do you preserve it? One of the interesting things about awe is that it can be retroactive. T.S. Eliot says we had the experience but missed the meaning. But I actually think that's not quite right. I think when you have an experience of awe, it can be that you had the experience but didn't need the meaning. And then later on, the meaning may come to you. And so an experience of awe can be something that you remember when at the time you may not have known you were in awe. There's a wonderful poem by Sarah Lindsay. I don't have it with me, but I can probably do most of it. It's called Small Moth, and she wrote it when she had little kids. And, it went right out of my head.
Don't worry about it. Well, actually, let's build on that a little bit too, because so I listened to a couple of days ago, partly to get ready for this, the conversation between Ezra Klein and Michael Pollan about Pollan's new book, which is also about consciousness. And they had a really interesting conversation, and they talked about a lot of the things that we're talking about. But I don't think God or faith ever came up once. They talked a lot more about psychedelics than they talked about God and faith. And maybe that's the new God and faith anyway. And they're certainly not unconnected. But maybe you could say a little bit, you've had a really interesting journey too. You started out in a pretty strict Christian environment, but didn't stay a person of faith. You've been on a journey. But just for the benefit of people, maybe give the short version of that journey, and then we'll talk a little bit about where you are now and how it fits into what we're talking about too.
Yeah, I grew up in West Texas, a small town in West Texas where, faith was just assumed. Everybody believed in one way or another. They had a lot of competing beliefs. The Church of Christ, people believed that we were going to hell, and we believed they were going to hell, and we all had those tiny, ridiculous arguments with each other. But I don't think I'd ever met anybody who didn't believe in God until I left and went off to Virginia to go to school. And it was a shock, and I hadn't really read any books until I went to school. I didn't grow up in a house with books. And so it was quite a existential shock. And anything called faith sort of fell away from me. And then, as I was saying, it was just poetry that kept that possibility alive for years. And it sustained a mystery that eventually I had to admit. And it wasn't enough that it was just poetry itself. For a long time, I just used the word poetry, and I wrote a lot of prose about this, where you can go back in my prose and you can substitute the word poetry for God, and it makes a lot more sense. And I think art is a means, not an end. The modernists made it an end in itself, and they made some great art. I love it. But but I think that art finally is a means. So I eventually began writing more about it, publishing a lot more about faith, and then I came here and gave a lecture, and I went home. Because I had my former intern, I was editing Poetry Magazine in Chicago at the time, and my former intern, who I took on when he was 18 years old at the University of Chicago, this kid just walks in the door, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was just starting. I was like, sure, why not? Hang around if you want. He turned out to be brilliant. I hired him, kept him there even while he was an undergraduate. He came to Divinity School here and got the committee to invite me to give a lecture. And so I came and gave this lecture, and because I knew Nate, his name's Nate Klug, wonderful poet, now a minister, I was with the students the whole time. Usually on these events, you go and you don't meet the students. You might talk to them, talk at them, but you don't meet the students. But because I was staying with Nate, I met a lot of students, and I really liked them. I mean, they were really interesting, and the conversations that I had were unlike the literary conversations that I was having, very unlike them. And I went home and I wrote a letter back here to Martin Jean it was the Institute of Sacred Music who had invited me, and I wrote a letter to Martin Jean. I said, you need to hire a poet. And at first Martin was like, what are you talking about? Maybe we'll bring you back for another visit. But the ball got going, and eventually Greg got involved, and it came to be. But that was very much an effort to put that original impulse of poetry seeming to be in search of God and disclosing God into action, to have my life more integrated.
I'm about a month away from my 50th reunion at this particular university, and one of the things we're supposed to do is write a little biography that goes up onto a website with all the other biographies. And I haven't written mine yet, but one of the things that I'm sort of struggling with is that I do feel as though I'd had kind of a normal mixture of life up until about the year 2020, when everybody that I loved and cared about got really, really sick, like really, really scary sick. I don't talk about this that much, and I don't ever want to violate his privacy. My son got very, very sick and is continuing to deal with the consequences. The woman I love, who's sitting over there, also terrifying medical problems. And she called me one night to say goodbye because she didn't think she was going to make it through the night. It was COVID, and I couldn't go to the hospital, and there was just so much suffering. And I told you, and you obviously have been through this incredible amount of suffering as well, physical suffering. In the middle of all this, I was, she was in the hospital. I was all alone in the house with this dog, and I reread Job, and I thought, well, this is stupid. This is God being kind of stupid. But then I started to reread Archibald MacLeish's play, J.B., which is a play in verse that's based on Job. And there's a line where J.B.'s wife eventually says, you wanted justice, didn't you? There isn't any. There's only love. And that, I think, is helpful, because I think when we're suffering, we think this is not right. This is happening to me or to the person I love. It's not happening to other people. Where's the justice in that? Maybe you could say a little bit. I mean, you've wrestled very publicly and openly with a lot of this stuff, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking about it right now.
Yeah, I don't know what my experience would be if my family were suffering. It would be quite different. I've never had the experience, even when I was first diagnosed, it was on my 39th birthday, and I never once had the experience, why me? It just seemed to me, well, why not me? I mean, and now that I've had it for 20 years, I'm surprised when somebody doesn't have it. I mean, I've met so many people suffering in so many different ways. I mean, it's just a surprise when people don't have it. There's a wonderful poem, which I will not try to quote, but I do have that other one in my head now, so I can. There's a wonderful poem by Anne Carson, which my students read here, that it's called God's Justice, and it starts with, on the day that when God was to create justice, he gets involved creating a dragonfly. He gets distracted and begins to create a dragonfly. The entire rest of the poem is a description of the dragonfly, and it ends with its black wings vibrating in and out. That's it. that's the end of justice. And the suggestion is, what the poem, the question that raises is, okay, so God started to create justice and then never got back to it? Like, oh, well, I forgot. Or is it that beauty is the answer to justice? That's the way that I read the book of Job. He gets this blast of beauty at the end. After all of his inquisitions, that's all he gets. But it's a mystical experience. It's love. It's what McLeish is saying in that play. I can't claim to have always been able to see that intellectually, but there have been times in my life when I've been able to feel it. Going back to the value of experience, I have felt in the midst of great suffering, great love. And some of it filtered through those around me. I have very close friends who took care of me this last time, certainly my wife, but some of it is not through them. Sometimes it is just love in the world, that it seems part of reality itself. And that's the reason I'm a Christian. I understand that to be the meaning of the incarnation, the meaning of the crucifixion, the resurrection, that God is in our suffering.
Could you connect your poem, Hammer is the Prayer, to that? Is there a way you can?
Oh, there's a direct connection, because this poem I wrote called Hammer is the Prayer, it's been 20 years ago now, or so, 21 years. I had not been to church in many, many years. I had not written a poem in 3 years. And I had just gotten this dire diagnosis and just gotten married, and all these things were going on. And my wife got me to go, as usual, to church just on the spur of the moment this one morning. And, we were in despair. And we walked down to the end of the block just because that's where the church was. It was a UCC church. I didn't have any idea what UCC was. And we just went in there. I thought it was just a regular Church of Christ like I grew up with. But I didn't care. It was a church. And we went in there, and it was an intense experience. 40 people, blasted people who desperately needed a church. And the minister was an amazing person who has become one of my closest friends. And I came home, and I wrote this poem in about an hour. And the poem has after those years of not being able to write anything, and the poem has a complicated form. I invented it. It's sort of like a villanelle where it repeats lines, but in this instance, there's one line, and what happens is I just change the punctuation. I don't change the syntax, so I change the punctuation in every instance so that it reads differently, okay? The poem is called Every Riven Thing. Every torn thing, every broken thing, riven, it's damage struck. God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made, sing his being simply by being the thing it is. Stone and tree and sky, man who sees and sings and wonders why God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of the atoms inside the stone. Think of the man who sits alone, trying to will himself into the stillness where God goes, belonging. To every riven thing he's made, there is given one shade, shaped exactly to the thing itself. Under the tree, a darker tree. Under the man, the only man to see, God goes, belonging to every riven thing. He's made the things that bring him near, made the mind that makes him go. A part of what man knows, apart from what man knows, God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made. It was a great gift to me.
Yeah. The poem, by the way, if you haven't ever read it, read it, because as good as he is at reading his poems, there's just things done with punctuation in this poem that you almost have to see on the page to sort of, it's a remarkable, remarkable poem. One of the things that I think in a very kind of stereotypical way when we think about faith, I think there's a little bit of a reflexive tendency to equate it with certainty. And uncertainty, I think, is probably a better thing to equate it with. And I think also consciousness. Consciousness is this, so-called felt uncertainty that probably the bean that's trying to make its little vine go up the pole, and maybe it's going to reach over and get to the other pole. The bean probably is sentient enough to think I've got a job to do here, to strive, but it probably isn't thinking, I don't think I'm going to make it, and I'm not even sure that there's any point in doing this. I don't think the bean plant does that, but we do. That's part of consciousness, is recognizing uncertainty. I want to try to connect that to something from the new book, to the book of letters. You write, I don't know what faith means anymore. I'm 56 years old with a pile of books behind me and an experimental bone marrow transplant ahead of me, and I don't know what faith means. That's uncertainty. There are versions of Christianity where it's not cool. It's not cool to write those words that you just wrote. Maybe say a little bit about uncertainty and what's there when you hear your words read back to you now, too.
Yeah, I'd probably write the same words, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't understand the equation of faith with certainty. I tend to draw a distinction between faith and belief. Belief includes dogmas, all the things that you attach to whatever religion you belong to, the things that bind people together, rituals and beliefs, Faith, I think, is prior to any religion. And I think there are plenty of people who have faith who wouldn't call themselves religious. And I don't just mean, I would like to avoid the saying, I'm spiritual but not religious. Even my students, even my undergraduates avoid that now. They can only say it with irony, I think there is a kind of faith that is emergent, very slowly, and the fight is tremendous against the kind of certitude that you're talking about. But there is a kind of faith, I think, that is emergent, that involves Christianity but is not limited to Christianity, and that people are finding ways to share. I think art is a tremendous part of this. I know a lot of people who find it impossible to have faith in religion, exactly, but they do have faith that seems to me religious. I mean, they do. Probably the best Christian in the world I know is himself not a Christian. If you talk about the way you live your life, he seems to me to live in a kind of exemplary life. But he wouldn't call himself a Christian, but he seems to me to have the faith that just, it's very, very admirable and just burns in him. And so I would like to have that kind of faith if I were going to choose. But I think uncertainty is like absence. Somebody said to me the other day, I've never been very interested in absence. And this was another poet, and I was like, what? It's like, I don't understand. It's not something you'd be interested or not interested in. It's like saying I'm not very interested in matter. I don't get it. And this uncertainty seems to me about the same. It's like uncertainty is the way it is, and that's just it. You got to deal with it. And it's the way it is down to the fundamental elements of the universe, that we can't predict them. We can to some degree, we do the best we can, but we're dealing with uncertainty at the fundamental level of existence. And so I just think it's just the way it is.
We're supposed to be wrapping up this segment, but I got one more place I want to go from these letters. So in a different one, you talk about how you live with a kind of restless and appetitive drive that often seems to, and I'll go right to the thing that I love here. You say, all of my writing has come out of it, every word, even in the works that have nothing to do with God. This is the sentence I love. I am after something, and that something is also after me. Can you say a little bit more about that, what that sentence means? Because it seems to connect with also what you were just saying before.
Yeah, it's very much about that reciprocal seeing that I talked about, where attention we direct attention outward and it seems to come back to us. There is something that I'm after, which I call God. but I am quite convinced that since I was a child, there's been something that's been coming after me, which is also called God. And they seem to me the same energy, trying to find some fulfillment, some unity, some release in me and in what I do. I'm not, and it's not right to say I'm not hopeful that it can't be resolved, but I wonder if it can. I don't know that it can. That may be living with uncertainty right there, is that you have to just live with that tension. There's a wonderful poem by Browning called Rabbi Ben Ezra, and he talks about the task of his life seems to have been to slake God's thirst. That's an interesting way to put it, wonderful way to put it. Richard Wilbur concludes a poem where he looks at a stream. This goes back to those notions of those moments of wonder in our lives. He describes this stream perfectly, Hamlin Brook it's called, and then it ends, joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and slake, leaving them dumbstruck also with an ache nothing can satisfy. This moment of absolute joy shadowed with some sort of sorrow. C.S. Lewis said that a moment of joy makes us homesick for a home we never realized we had. So there is this fruition, but on this side of the grave, it's always shadowed with something too.
Okay, I'm really glad I asked that question. But now we have to take a real break. We'll take a little break. We'll be back in just a second. Okay, we're back, and before we get back to Christian Wiman, there's lots of people that I have to thank. First of all the terrific people that I work with, Dylan Reyes, Megan Boone, Lily Tyson, Jonathan McNicol, Robyn Doyon-Aitken, also Katrice Kemble, our boss, Vanessa De La Torre, and also thanks to the people at Yale Div School for making this happen, especially Dean Gregory Sterling, Tom Krattenmaker, Sachin, Ramabhadran, I hope I did that okay, Kit Heeley, and Campbell Harmon. Thanks to everybody who helped out here today. This is so much fun to come here, and this is an amazing place, and a lot of really good feelings, I think, in the room as well. So yes, we are here with Christian Wiman. Also, I should say, we're really excited. Megan Boone got us this new clock. You can't see it, but there's this really cool digital clock here on the floor that I'm enjoying very much. Radio is all about time. Christian Wiman, author, editor, translator of 15 books, including most recently Glimmerings. We've just been talking about that. Letters on Faith Between a Poet and a Theologian. A Clement Mule Professor of Communication Arts at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music and Yale Divinity School. We've been talking about poetry all the way through, but we want to talk a little bit about poetry as equipment for living. I was saying to you before, we were talking before the show started, but for me, poetry is kind of I don't write poetry, but poetry is a toolbox. Like, I just have it, There's a William Meredith poem that's framed behind me on the wall of the office where I do my writing. And I mean, they're just all kinds of poems that I pull out all the time because you need them. It's like break glass in case of emergency. There's the poem there behind that glass. But maybe say a little bit more about how you see that too, about this idea of equipment for living.
Yeah, I've found the poems that I read, I've gotten better about this, but I find the poems that I read more equipment for living than the poems that I write. Often the poems that I write, I don't understand. I mean, I don't understand where they came from. I follow these sounds, and they come to mean something to me afterwards. I don't try to be obscure. I try to be as clear as I can. But I often feel weirdly detached from my own poems. And the old ones seem kind of like moonstones to me. Somebody comes up and tells me they love this poem, I don't care. You tell me you hate it, I don't care. But if you tell me you hate a poem that I've said I loved, that bothers me. That bothers me. There are certain things that I don't teach because I've had not a great experience with them. Things that I really love that doesn't go across very well. But equipment for living, I think I now have that poem called Small Moth by Sarah Lindsay in my head.
Do it.
I might mess it up, but whatever, live event. She is slicing ripe white peaches into the Tony the Tiger bowl, dropping slivers for the dog, poised, vibrating by her foot to catch their fall when she spots it. Glimmering, then full on, happiness, plashing blunt, soft wings inside of her as if it wants to escape again. This is a woman with little kids going about her day slicing peaches in the Tony the Tiger bowl, and she spots this small moth, which she calls happiness, and then it's plashing, that weird word in this poem, plashing, as if the element has suddenly changed, we're underwater. You know, if you've had small kids and you go about this, you're not always thinking, I am so happy doing this. You know, you're rushed and harried and you're irritated a lot of the times. And suddenly she has this moment and she realizes, you know what? I'm actually happy. Now that's equipment for living. There's a poem, I first read that poem, I published that poem in Poetry Magazine. I first read that poem and I thought, how many times have I done that? How many times have I missed this? Or how many times have I not let myself be happy just because it's like a habit of mind or something? Or you have to somehow be antagonistic toward life in order to feel it. So that is a poem that actually enabled me to live differently, to think about my life differently.
I think sometimes also poems have this remarkable ability to take something that you would have said was just way too complicated, I couldn't possibly explain it, it would take me hours to explain it. And then it's there in just a tiny few words. Yeah. I was getting ready to write, in fact, a memoir about my father, which was going to be a memoir about my parents, and I was just thinking this is going to be, I'd been offered a contract to do this, and I think the publisher had no idea how dark and complicated a topic this was going to be, and I was, how am I going to do this? And then I read a poem by Louise Gluck. It's from the collection Meadowlands, and it's called Telemachus's Detachment. Telemachus is the son of Odysseus. It's Odysseus Day here. He's the son of Odysseus and Penelope, and the poem just goes, when I was a child looking at my parents' lives, you know what I thought? I thought, heartbreaking. Now I think heartbreaking, but also insane, also very funny. I thought, okay, that's my whole book. That's like, I don't even have to write the book anymore. But it is, you will still encounter people, maybe they don't do this around you, but you encounter people who say, well, I don't really read poetry, I don't like poetry. Poetry, this is not for me. Yeah. And it's a little bit like when you were talking about absence before. I think, when they say that, I think, it's like someone's showing you their tool shed and they say, well, I don't like wrenches, though I don't have any wrenches. I don't know, do you have a response when people say poetry is just not for them?
It depends on who it is, but I often will quote something by Ogden Nash, like, behold the duck, it does not cluck, a cluck it lacks, it quacks. It is specially fond of a puddle or pond, and when it dines or sups, it bottoms ups. How can you not like that? But also, if you think about it, I was just walking just a couple of days ago through a park here in Hamden. I'm forgetting the name of the Racebrook Park, and we were with our kids who are now teenagers, and we were remembering. My wife and I were remembering. They memorized that poem when they were 3 years old, and of course, I led them to it, and I probably paid them for it, But they memorized it, and we were remembering the time that after they'd memorized it, we went to that park, and they saw a duck do that, bottoms ups, and they said, "Look, it actually does that." and so that's an instant. The poem actually can make you see something that you wouldn't pay attention to.
We're going to end on a note of joy, and it has been a joy to be here and to share all of your wonderfulness with these people. But thank you for your time. Thank you for trusting us with this, and thank you for coming out tonight.
But remember what I tell you, that in time you're gonna pay, and it's surprising how time